The last question I've got to ask you, I know we have a short time because we want to get in so many of the people who want to respect and offer tributes to Stan, but also just this business about visions of social control, the idea of informal social control stretching beyond the prison. Could you say a word about that? How significant is that argument?
Well, that was absolutely crucial and prophetic. What Stan did in Visions of Social Control was he predicted a number of things that have happened in social control in the last 20 years. For example, he was one of the first people to talk about risk. He also talked about how the state, even though it looked like in the 1960s that it was contracting and getting smaller, was actually like an octopus that was stretching out its tentacles. There wasn't a destructuring movement, there wasn't a collapse of the state, but rather the state was now starting to use the private sector. The state was now starting to use the voluntary sector. And if we look at the criminal justice system and we look at what's been happening in the last 2 or 3 years and this notion of payment by results, this book was written in 1985 and I'm talking about something that was announced in 2010. The book predicts it. The book is an amazing, prophetic, profound and theoretically rich analysis.
David Scott. And there we're going to stop. Thank you very, very much. One of the consequences of so many young sociologists taking up the study of deviance was an explosion in ethnographic studies. Researchers sought access to the culture of groups which had previously been either dismissed or marginalised as, well, just criminal or antisocial, no interest. Football hooligans, industrial saboteurs, drug users, vandals, prostitutes, down and outs, all became subjects of the sociological gaze. All were required to yield up their cultural secrets. Well, Stan was quick to recognise the unilateral nature of this enterprise, its privileging of the observer over the observed, and he used a fable which was published in Sociological Review in 1979 as the last seminar to illustrate his concerns. Howard Becker remembers.
In that fable, he tells about a university where the subjects of criminological research started showing up on the campus of the university, silently, sitting in the classes taught by the social scientists who had studied them, making their real human presence felt by those who had been able, up until then, to treat them as patients or convicts, as abstractions. And then in the story he tells, the situation deteriorates until these people, the people we had all studied, burn the campus down, teaching us that they are not just the raw material of our ideas, but they're real, and don't forget it.
Howard Becker. Well, a year later, in 1990, it must have been, yes, came a development that was to exert a pretty critical influence on Stan's subsequent academic work. I said a year later, it must have been longer than, yes, 10 years later, really. Together with his wife, Stan decided to move to Israel. And when he arrived there, he quickly became concerned about allegations that the Israeli security forces had used torture against Palestinians detained for interrogation during the years of the Intifada. The research, which he and his team subsequently conducted, concluded, and I quote, that although methods of collecting information are not always reliable, these reports show that practices definable as ill treatment or torture have been used against Palestinian detainees. Now, what particularly interested Stan following the publication of this report was the manner in which various official and unofficial bodies sought to either deny or play down or ignore or reinterpret the evidence that had been placed before them. What David was talking about before, an interest which for Stan formed the starting point for his 2001 prize-winning book, States of Denial. In 2004, following the Abu Ghraib torture revelation, Stan himself came on this programme to speak about how this new development had even undermined the classic traditional argument that torture could be justified if it led to the ticking bomb.
It's become democratised, it's become taken out of the box of total prohibition, and it's entered a discourse in which it's just one way of doing things among others. And what we are seeing now, though, is a quantitative jump from that. Even if that wasn't bad enough, what we're seeing now is the kind of joyous quality of it, the hedonistic quality of it, which is crucial because it removes the utilitarian argument. The whole point of the ticking bomb was you do it in order to save lives. Nobody on earth can pretend that what is being done now is done to save lives.
By now, Stan was back in England, helping to establish the Centre for the Study of Human Rights at the London School of Economics. Conor Gearty, the former director of the centre and now Professor of Human Rights at LSE, recall Stan's distinctive take on the subject.
Stan's truly original insight into the study of human rights at LSE was that this was a subject that didn't need to be the preserve of the lawyers, that there were routes to understanding human rights which were well beyond, though complementary to, what the lawyers could do. Stan drove this extraordinary at the time idea that you have these experts come in from law, from social policy, from sociology, and they take these looks, as it were, joint looks at human rights, and he'd do joint teaching. And of course he was absolutely dazzling. He had this incredible capacity to root behind the convention. So all the rest of us were studying section this of article that, or pondering the meaning of the latest protocol, and Stan would be looking quizzically at us, amazed at the narrowness of our vision, before he produced some bon mot, which really rendered us in the nicest possible way into a kind of collection of laughingstocks. So deep was his knowledge of the thing compared to our pedantic legal commitment to detail above all.
Conor Gearty. Well, I'm now joined in the studio by someone who taught on that human rights course with Stan and who used his work on denial in her own research on social control. She's Claire Moon, who's senior lecturer in the sociology of human rights at the LSE. Well, let me ask with this general question that I've been using, that I used a bit with David. Well, I mean, what would you say was the significance of Stan's work to the field of human rights? I mean, how much does this concept of denial stand at the centre of it?
Well, it's absolutely central, and that's a major contribution. And I think the interesting thing about his work on denial is that it's continuous really with the work on moral panics, because if moral panic was about this overreaction to social problems, denial was really about the underreaction to atrocity, to suffering, to human rights violations. And typically he took a rather unsettling approach to the problem, because he tackled not only state denials of atrocity, through looking at the kind of voodoo talk and the kind of linguistic slippages that mask the fact that torture is carried out. You know, the use of moderate physical pressure. It's not really torture. It's just,
and all that.
Yes. Or it's not really genocide. It's just a little bit of population transfer and so on. But he tackled those things. But he also tackled the good guys, the humanitarian communicators, the NGOs themselves. And he looked also at the ways in which consumers of humanitarian communication, people like you and I, those who are being appealed to through disaster appeals, Amnesty International campaigns and so on, how do they avoid responding to these kinds of appeals, and
yes,
how do they deny that?
Using the phrase the croissant vignette here, what was he talking about there?
Right, yes. Well, the croissant vignette, as I've come to know it, is really one of the opening gambits of states of denial. And in this he describes this picture, in a sense, of a nice middle-class couple who are breakfasting on coffee and croissant, and they're browsing the weekend papers, and out of the papers fall a sheaf of humanitarian campaigns. And his question is, what does this information do to them, and what do they do with this information themselves? And so this question really informed his investigation into what he called bystander alibis, and the kind of language or the kind of excuses that we use to avoid responding. Oh, it's just one thing after another. It's always gone on. It's just the way it is. It's not my problem. And what he did was to show how these were ideological justifications masquerading as common sense.
And you've in a way taken this a step further, because you looked at human rights reports, about the nature of human rights reports, about the way in which they're presented, which almost might seem, I think there's something about the way they're presented which almost seems to you to inhibit the possibility of action.
Yes, well, this was really an extension of the questions that Stan is posing about the credos that underpin human rights reporting, and one of which is this issue of decontextualising political violence. So violations must be presented in such a way as not to hint at politics behind it or history behind it. This is partly because human rights organisations have to present themselves as being objective. So this, in a sense, I take this one step further to suggest that this form of decontextualisation might actually facilitate the kind of detachment that is demonstrated in the croissant vignette, if you like, because it helps us to see that, as citizens, as consumers, we don't actually, we're not actually implicated in distant suffering. We can't actually act to make a difference.
We can't do anything to change it,
We can't do anything about
so we can throw up our hands and turn away and get on with it. I mean, you've also, though, I think you've also looked at the question of deniability in relationship to the question of past reparations, when you've had a regime which has been particularly brutal and there is an attempt, as it were, to, I hate the word closure, but anyway, attempt to reduce closure by providing reparations or courts of justice or whatever. You've looked at that as well, haven't you, in the context of Stan's work?
Yes, this is an area of his work that was concerned with policing the past. And it was around questions that were really big and relevant to the post-Cold War, political transitions to democracy across Latin America, Eastern Europe and South Africa. And the issue was about how do states in transition confront human rights violations of previous regimes. And one of the things that I've looked at is the use of reparations in Argentina as a way of silencing victims' calls for justice.
So you hand over some cash and you don't have any more investigations into who was guilty.
Precisely. And there's a group of the mothers of the disappeared who actually refused reparations because they recognised that this is a way of controlling their calls for justice.
Last little quick question. How do students, your students on the human rights course, react to Stan's account of denial? I mean, this is a rather odd element within a human rights course, isn't it?
It is, actually, and I have to usually justify talking about denial on the programme itself. But once I introduce them to it, they're pretty fanatical about it. I have a huge number of converts, and they usually rush to write their master's dissertations about the problem. And I think one of the most fruitful legacies of his work really is enthusing so many students, and we've had numerous PhD projects that have taken up this question.
That's very nice to end on that note of enthusiasm, remembered enthusiasm. Claire Moon, thank you very much. I'm going to leave the last word today to Stuart Hall and the last notes to Stan's beloved Schubert.
What I remember is the combination of things. You know, he was an extremely shrewd observer. He was a very humane person. He was deeply ironic about the foibles of life. Nothing escaped him. And at the same time, he was a committed person. I mean, the work on torture and the work on human rights. But it didn't affect the fact he was one of the most humorous people in the world. So I loved spending time with him because all these facets were brought to bear. We would move from one serious topic right into the most bizarre. Not many people take you on that kind of journey.